Three kings hit the table face up, and the room stopped breathing. Garrick Vane's hand was already shaking before he turned his cards over. Two pair aces and eights, dead man's hand, and he knew it the second he saw the fan of silver-ringed fingers laying down royalty he couldn't beat. Behind his chair, a girl in a cream dress stood with a rope looped once around her wrist, close enough to the man across the table that she could see for the first time in her life. Someone else deciding what happened to her, because that was the wager. Not gold. Her. And the man who just won her didn't reach for her at all. He reached for his glass. Nobody in the Red Creek poker room understood, in that first frozen second, what they'd just watched. They thought they'd seen a king buy a girl the way men had been buying girls in that room for years. They were wrong. What they'd actually seen, what none of them would understand, until 30 years later, when the whole kingdom finally learned her name, was a man 347 years old spending his entire fortune to make absolutely certain nobody could ever do this to her again. But to understand that hand, you have to go back to before the cards were even dealt. Red Creek wasn't a town. It was a wound with a bar built over it, a frontier trading post where the law thinned to nothing past the last lamppost, and the things that did business in its back rooms weren't always fully human. The Red Creek poker room sat at the center of it, low ceilings, thick lamp smoke, and the particular quiet men kept when they'd learned not to ask whose girl was whose. Garrick Vane had built a career on that silence. 56 years old, going soft at the middle, a waxed mustache he tended like other men tended their pride. Garrick had once run honest freight between the territories before the freight stopped paying and the game started paying better. For 3 years he'd made his living the easy way, finding people nobody would come looking for, and finding a use for them at tables exactly like this one. Serafina Wren was the newest, 19 years old, though hunger had aged the set of her mouth years past that. Her parents were gone, dead under circumstances nobody had ever fully explained to her, and the only thing she'd carried out of that life was a small silver pendant crescent and thorn, a symbol she'd never once seen matched anywhere in the 19 years since. Garrick had found her half-starved outside a mission, and told her, gently at first, that she owed him, for the food, for the roof, for the ride west. The debt never shrank, no matter what she gave him. Tonight he meant to collect the rest of it in one hand of cards. The game had been running for hours by the time it came down to just the two of them, Garrick and a broad-shouldered rancher who folded early, sensing where the night was headed and wanting no part of it. Garrick kept playing. He lost his coin first, then his watch, throw, and when he had nothing left to put on the table, he reached back, closed his hand around Serafina's wrist, and pulled her forward into the lamplight. "She's mine to wager," he said. Freedom against the pot. The room went still in a way it hadn't for the coin or the watch or the worthless deed. Men had wagered gold in that room for years without anyone so much as glancing up. Nobody wagered a person. It wasn't conscience that silenced them. Most of that room had long since spent theirs. It was the raw, ugly breach of an unspoken line. The kind that made even hardened men reach for their glasses just to have somewhere to put their hands. Serafina didn't scream. She didn't fight. She'd learned, in 2 years under Garrick's roof, that neither did any good. She stared at the scarred wood of the table and waited to find out which stranger would own her by morning. That was the moment the doors opened. Nobody had heard footsteps outside. Nobody ever did, with him. But the room felt it before it saw it. The way a held breath feels a storm 2 ridgelines out. Conversations died mid-sentence. A man near the bar set his drink down without finishing it. The bartender's hand went still on the tap. King Valor Nightshade walked into the Red Creek poker room the way a tide comes in, unhurried and with no sense at all that anything in the room could stop him if it tried. Silver hair fell loose past his shoulders, black velvet gold thread at the cuffs, a signet ring worth more than the building around them. He dressed like a man who had stopped needing to prove anything a very long time ago, because the proving had already been done once in blood 3 centuries back. He was known through every kingdom bordering his for exactly 3 things. He never lost a game of chance. He never broke a promise he'd made. And in 347 years, no one had ever seen him show mercy to a man who tested either of the first two. Nobody in that room expected him to care what happened to a human orphan over a poker table. Then his eyes found the pendant at her throat. Crescent and thorn, small tarnished, the only thing of her mother's she owned. And for exactly one breath, something behind his eyes changed. He said nothing. He had learned, a very long time ago, the value of silence at the right moment. Garrick, drunk on the smell of a win he hadn't earned yet, mistook that silence for hesitation. He laughed, called the Vampire King soft for even glancing twice at a human girl, and dared him to sit down if he had the nerve. The room braced for violence. Men who had seen Valar Nightshade angry before started calculating how fast they could reach the door. Instead, the king pulled out the one empty chair, sat, and set his entire fortune on the table, without bothering to count it. "Deal me in." Garrick blinked, then grinned, already spending gold he hadn't won. He had no idea he wasn't playing against a man who wanted the girl. He was playing against the one man in 3 kingdoms who wanted her free, and was about to burn everything he owned to prove it. Chapter 2. The cards came out slow. Nobody in the Red Creek poker room breathed the way they normally breathe. Men who'd spent the last 3 hours barely glancing up from their own glasses now watched every twitch of the dealer's hands like their lives depended on it. Some suspected they did. Garrick Vane didn't share their caution. Winning had made him reckless once already tonight, and the sight of the king's fortunes stacked on the pine had gone straight to his head. "You know what you're doing here, don't you?" Garrick said, fanning his cards without looking at them, eyes on Valar instead. "A vampire, sitting down to gamble over a human girl. Some of your own kind would call that beneath you. Some of my own kind talk a great deal for creatures who rarely live past their first century," Valar said, without heat. He didn't touch his cards yet either. Garrick's grin flickered, unsure whether he'd been insulted. He decided to laugh it off and pressed on. 300 years old, and you're going to sit at a table with the rest of us like a man who needs the money. I don't need the money." Valar finally lifted his cards, unhurried, and studied them with the same mild attention he might give a letter of no particular importance. "I need you to keep playing." That silenced Garrick for a moment, though he didn't understand why. Valar watched him the way he watched everything, completely. He heard the stutter in Garrick's pulse each time he bluffed, the tell in his eyes half a second before he reached for more chips than his cards justified. 3 centuries of sitting across from liars had taught him to read a heartbeat the way other men read a newspaper. He could have won this hand blind. He chose not to. Some old, stubborn part of him refused to let this win be anything less than clean. He had broken enough rules in 300 years. Not this one. The hand played out across 4 more rounds, the pot climbing each time, until there was nothing left in front of Garrick but the girl standing behind his chair. He knew it. The room knew it. Seraphina, still and pale by the empty seat, knew it better than anyone. Garrick shoved the last of his pride onto the table along with his cards. "Her freedom's in the pot now," he said, loud enough that the whole room heard it as a declaration rather than a wager. "You win. She's yours. Bought and paid for, same as anything else on this table." "No," Valar said. The word landed flat and final, and half the room leaned in, certain they'd misheard. "If I win," he said, "she belongs to herself." Nobody understood it. A murmur moved through the room, men turning to each other for an explanation nobody could give. It was a strange thing to say about a wager, as if the girl standing behind Garrick's chair still had a say in anything happening to her, as if freedom were something you could hand back across a poker table like change. Seraphina understood. In 2 years since Garrick found her outside that mission, no one had ever spoken about her as though she still possessed a choice. She had been an obligation, then a debt, then a wager. Here was a stranger, older than the mountains around them, saying otherwise in front of a room full of men who'd have sold her without blinking. She didn't move. She didn't dare hope yet. But something in her chest, long gone quiet, shifted. The final cards fell. Garrick turned his over first, too eager to wait, and the grin was already dying on his face before the last card landed. 2 pair. Nothing that would survive what Valar laid down beside it. Unhurried, one card at a time. 3 kings. The room didn't erupt. It went silent the way it had when the wager was first named. That same held-breath quiet, everyone waiting to see whether this would end in violence. Vaylor rose from the table. He crossed where Serafina stood, and for the first time since she'd been dragged into that room, someone approached her without pulling. He reached for the rope binding her wrist and cut it loose with a single motion. Careful, unhurried, as though her hand were something breakable he had no intention of breaking. "You are not my property," he said. Then he gave her the only thing nobody in that room had ever offered her before: a choice. She could take enough gold to disappear from Red Creek entirely and never look back. Or she could come to his castle, under his protection, owing him nothing. Serafina looked toward the door. Freedom, uncertain and cold, waited on the other side of it. She looked at Garrick, slumped and emptied of everything he'd built his cruelty on. Then she looked at Vaylor. "The castle," she said. Garrick found his voice as he backed toward the door, gathering what little was left of his dignity along with it. "You don't know what that girl is," he spat. One last attempt at cutting something on his way out. Vaylor's expression didn't change, but something behind it went very still. "Neither do you," he said. Garrick didn't wait to hear more. He was gone into the night within the minute, and no one in Red Creek saw him again for 30 years. Vaylor said little as they walked out into the cold. When Serafina began to shiver, he unclasped his own cloak without a word and settled it over her shoulders, careful never to let his hand linger against her skin longer than the motion required. His guards, when they met the party on the road, were given a single order. She was a guest, not a servant, and would be treated as one. They crested the last ridge, as the moon cleared the peaks, and the nightshade castle rose in front of them. Not the black crumbling ruin she'd braced herself for, but hundreds of windows glowing gold and warm against the mountain, dark like something that had been waiting patiently to be lived in again. Vaylor looked at her once and said the only thing he needed to: "No one will ever wager you again." The castle swallowed sound the way it swallowed everything else, completely, and without apology. Serafina had expected resentment. She'd braced herself on the ride up, for servants who'd sneer at a human girl brought home like a stray, for whispers behind doors, for someone to make her understand exactly how little she belonged there. Instead, what she found in her first days at Nightshade Castle was something closer to confusion. The staff didn't know how to look at her. A young manservant nearly dropped a tray the first time she thanked him. An older woman in the kitchens studied her for a long moment before asking, carefully, whether she required anything at all, as though the question itself were unfamiliar. It took Serafina 3 days to understand why. Nobody in that castle had seen the king bring a human through its doors in decades. Not as a guest, not as anything. The castle itself did nothing to contradict that impression. It was enormous. Corridors that ran longer than entire streets in Red Creek, ceilings lost in shadow, rooms furnished and dusted and utterly unused. Everything gleamed with wealth, and nothing in it felt lived in. She began to notice it more each day. Vaylor had everything a man could want in 3 lifetimes, let alone one that had lasted 347 years, armies at his command, gold beyond counting, servants who anticipated his every need before he voiced it, immortality itself. And yet he moved through his own castle like a man serving a sentence in it. He ate alone, always at the same long table, always facing the same empty chairs. He walked the grounds alone at night, guards trailing at a respectful distance. He never once invited closer. When the kitchens prepared for a feast day, and the staff quietly asked whether he'd attend, Serafina noticed the answer was always some version of no, delivered before the question finished being asked. His library was the strangest room in the castle. Shelves rose 3 stories into darkness, packed with histories older than most kingdoms, and almost nothing personal among them. No letters left carelessly open, no portraits, no trinkets. A man keeps simply because they mean something. It was a room built entirely out of the past and nothing of the person who owned it. She wasn't supposed to be in the deeper end of it. She found that out, the hard way, drawn past a heavy curtain into a narrower section of shelving she hadn't been told was forbidden, because nobody had thought to tell her the castle had rooms with rules at all. She was midway through pulling a cracked leather volume free when Valor's voice came from the doorway, quiet, without anger. "You shouldn't be here." She turned, expecting the punishment she'd braced for since the poker room. Instead, he only watched her, waiting. "I was curious," she admitted. "I didn't know it was forbidden." He studied her a long moment, the same unhurried attention he'd given his cards the night he'd won her freedom, and then, instead of ordering her out, he told her she was welcome to use the library. All of it. He'd simply asked that she be careful with what she found there. It was such a small thing, but it was the first time since Red Creek that someone had responded to her as a person making a choice, rather than a problem requiring a decision. She began, slowly, to change the castle in return. She brought flowers in from the gardens no one had touched in years and set them in rooms that had never held anything living. She hummed while she worked, quietly at first, until it became simply something she did. She had the heavy curtains in the east hall drawn back to let morning through, instead of kept shut against a sun that couldn't hurt the servants who lived there. She talked to the kitchen staff as though they were people worth talking to, and slowly they started talking back, to her and to each other. Valor complained about none of it out loud, though she caught him once, standing in a hallway that now smelled faintly of lavender, wearing an expression she couldn't quite name. He never told her to stop. He simply allowed it, one small change at a time, the way a man allows whether he's decided not to fight. It was in the library, 3 weeks into her stay, that everything shifted. She was reaching for a volume on a high shelf when the old leather binding split beneath her fingers, and the edge of it caught her palm. A single drop of blood fell before she could stop it, and struck a flat black stone set into the floor beneath the shelf, one she'd never paid any attention to before. The stone began to glow, not brightly, a dull, deep red, pulsing faintly like something breathing beneath the surface. Serafina stepped back, heart hammering, just as Valor appeared in the doorway so quickly she never heard him cross the room. His face, for the first time since she'd met him, held real fear. "Don't move," he said, and crossed to her side, pulling her hand away from the shelf before she could touch anything else. He knelt and studied the stone without touching it himself, his jaw tight, something ancient and wary moving behind his eyes. "Never touch that again," he told her. "Whatever you do in this library, never that." "What is it?" she asked. He was quiet long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer at all. "Something that should have remained dead," he said finally, and said nothing more, no matter how she pressed him. That night, long after the castle had gone still, and Serafina had finally fallen asleep, Valor descended alone to a chamber deep beneath the west tower, one sealed for longer than any servant in his household had been alive. He unlocked it with a key he hadn't touched in 19 years. Inside, beneath a sheet gone gray with dust, hung an old portrait of a human woman. Pale hair, a crescent and thorn pendant at her throat, a face that could have been Serafina's own, painted decades before Serafina had ever been born. Valor stood before it for a long time. Then he reached out, touched the edge of the frame with 2 fingers, and said the only words the chamber had heard in 19 years. "I found her." The years moved differently in a castle that didn't age. Serafina noticed it first in small things. A dress let out at the seams, then replaced entirely. A voice that had stopped catching on unfamiliar words. Hands that no longer shook when she picked up a pen. Valor noticed it in the way she argued with him now, without hesitation, in a tone no one else in the kingdom would have dared use. He had decided, within her first year at Nightshade, that knowledge was the only armor he could give her that no one could take away. So, he taught her. Vampire history first, then kingdom politics, then languages that let her read treaties in their original hand, rather than some minister's translation. Medicine, because a queen who understood the body understood her people. Diplomacy, because words, wielded correctly, ended wars gold never could. Ancient mythology last, though he was careful, in those early years, about how much of it he let her see. She absorbed all of it the way she'd once absorbed hunger and cold, completely, and without complaint. The relationship shifted with the seasons, though neither of them marked the exact day it happened. Strangers first, bound only by a debt neither of them had asked for. Then protector and protected. Valor watching over her the way a man watches something fragile he's sworn to keep intact. Then, slowly, something closer to friendship. Late evenings in the library that stretched past midnight. Arguments over old texts that neither of them truly wanted to win. By her 3rd year in the castle, she had become the only person in his kingdom willing to tell him, to his face, when he was wrong. She told him when his counsel's counsel was cowardice, dressed up as caution. She argued more than once against executions his advisors called necessary and she called convenient. She was the one who finally convinced him that human settlements along the border didn't need to be frightened into loyalty. That fear built kingdoms that eventually burned, and trust built ones that lasted. He listened. That, more than anything, was what changed him. A king 3 centuries old who had never once needed to answer to anyone, began quietly deferring to a girl he'd won at a poker table. The turning point came on a night neither of them had seen coming. The attack hit the castle just past midnight, a coordinated strike against the outer wall, fire catching fast in the old timber halls before the guards could contain it. Vela gave the order to get every human servant to the lower cellars and expected, without question, that Serafina would be among them. She wasn't. He found her instead in a burning east corridor, half carrying an injured guard twice her size, smoke thick enough that she should have collapsed twice over. He hauled the guard's other arm over his own shoulder without a word, got them both clear, and only then rounded on her with a fury she'd never once seen directed at herself. "You could have died in there," he said. "You were told to go to the cellars." "I know what I was told. You have no idea what you're capable of surviving. You are not." He stopped himself, but not soon enough. "Not what?" she said. "Not strong enough. Not yours to risk?" She was still breathing hard. Soot streaked across her cheek, and she didn't back down an inch. "You told me, the first night I met you, that I wasn't your property, that I belonged to myself. You don't get to say that and then decide, whenever it's convenient, that I'm too helpless to choose what I do with my own life." He had no answer for that. For the first time in 347 years, someone had used his own words against him, and won. It was in the quiet after, tending the wounded together in the lower hall, that he began letting pieces of the past slip loose. "I knew your mother," he said, so quietly she nearly missed it over the crackle of the dying fires outside. "Once, before you were born." Serafina went still. "You never told me that. There wasn't a way to tell you that wasn't also telling you everything else." He was quiet for a long moment, watching the bandage he was tying rather than her face. "She asked me for something, many years ago. A favor. I gave her my word." "What favor?" "A promise," he said. "One I intend to keep." He wouldn't say more that night, no matter how she asked, and something in his expression told her not to push further than he was willing to give. But something had shifted between them all the same. Some final wall come down, the kind that only comes down once. In the weeks that followed, the careful distance he'd always kept began to feel less like caution and more like restraint. He was fighting to hold on to. He was careful with her, deliberately so. He knew exactly how much power he held over a girl who had nowhere else to go, and he refused, on principle, to ever let that imbalance shape what grew between them. It was Serafina, in the end, who closed the distance he wouldn't. A hand resting a moment too long over his on a library table. A silence held instead of filled. Neither of them named it. Neither of them needed to. It was on one of those quiet evenings, turning her mother's pendant over in her hands, the way she'd done 1,000 times before, that Serafina finally noticed the seam along its edge. A hinge so fine she'd never felt it under her thumb until now. Inside, folded smaller than a coin, was a scrap of paper gone brittle and brown with age. Most of the ink had faded past reading. Only one line remained. "Trust the king who comes when you have nowhere left to go." Serafina read it twice. Then a third time, the fire in the hearth suddenly very loud in the silence of the room. Her mother hadn't simply known Valor. Her mother had expected him. She kept the letter, but she never got the chance to ask him about it that week. Word came the following morning that the eastern border had flooded, and the king and the woman he could no longer imagine ruling without spent the next 3 years too occupied with the work of a kingdom to dwell long on one faded line of ink. By the time Valor asked her to marry him, it didn't feel sudden. It felt to both of them, like something that had already happened quietly years before either of them said it aloud. The wedding split the court in two. Some vampires, old enough to remember when the nightshade line had never once mingled with human blood, called it a disgrace. A king humbling himself and his bloodline with him, for a woman who wasn't even fully grown when he'd won her at a card table. Others, more pragmatic and more dangerous, worried less about honor and more about influence. A queen who had the king's ear as thoroughly as Seraphina did was a queen who could reshape a kingdom simply by talking to him at breakfast. Valor addressed both factions the same way. He stood before his full council the morning after the ceremony and made his position impossible to misunderstand. "She is not beneath this throne," he said. "She is beside it. Anyone who threatens my queen threatens my kingdom, and I will treat the two as one and the same." Nobody tested him on it twice. What silenced the doubters in the end wasn't the king's warning. It was Seraphina herself. She governed the way she'd once fought to survive Red Creek, with total, unglamorous practicality. She opened trade with the human settlements along the border that Valor's advisors had spent decades frightening into submission, and found, within a year, that a kingdom that traded honestly needed far fewer soldiers than one that ruled by fear. She tore apart laws that had let nobles treat servants as property, the way she herself had once been treated, and rewrote them with her own hand. She uncovered two lords, quietly skimming grain from villages already starving, and had them stripped of title before the week was out. She built hospitals in towns that had never had one. She found orphaned children the way someone had once, briefly, failed to find her, and made certain the kingdom's ledgers included a line for their care that no minister was permitted to cut. The woman who had once stood tethered behind a poker table, waiting to learn which stranger would own her, was now the reason half the kingdom slept easier at night. Nobody called her a wager anymore, not out loud. The 30th year crept up on them, the way all the best years had, quietly, and then all at once. The court began planning a celebration before Seraphina had fully registered the date approaching, and when she realized what they intended to mark, something in her went cold. "I don't want a festival built around Red Creek," she told Valor the night the plans were presented to her. "I don't want the whole kingdom toasting to the night I nearly belonged to another man." "They're not toasting to that," Valor said. "They're toasting to the night it stopped mattering. It still matters to me." He took her hand, the way he'd learned to over 30 years, careful and certain at once. "The past doesn't own us anymore, Seraphina. Only the ones we let it own." She let herself be convinced. She wished, later, that she hadn't been. The anniversary ceremony filled the great hall with more nobles than Seraphina had seen, gathered in one place since her wedding. She stood at Valor's side, composed, gracious, 30 years removed from the girl with a rope around her wrist, until an elderly vampire near the back of the hall, one of the oldest bloodlines left in the kingdom, rose from his seat without warning and crossed the entire length of the room to kneel before her. The hall went silent, the way it had the night Garrick first named his wager. "The Wren blood has returned," the old vampire whispered, loud enough for the front rows to hear, and then loud enough for everyone. It spread through the hall like fire through dry timber. One elder, then another, dropped their eyes from Seraphina as though the sight of her had become something to fear rather than admire. Whispers she couldn't quite catch moved table to table faster than she could follow them. Valor's expression didn't change, but his hand tightened around hers. By morning, the royal archivists had turned the oldest sealed shelves in the castle inside out, and what they found silenced the last of the celebration entirely. A single line, buried in a text so old its binding had nearly crumbled to dust. "When the daughter of the Wren blood enters the Nightshade throne, the first curse shall awaken." Seraphina read it herself, twice, in a hand that wasn't quite steady. "What does this mean?" she asked Valor that night, the two of them alone in the library where, 30 years earlier, a black stone had once answered a single drop of her blood with a glow neither of them had ever fully explained. "Nothing," he said. It was the first lie he had told her in 30 years, and she knew it the moment it left his mouth, knew it the way she'd once known, at 19. Exactly which men in a poker room could be trusted, and which couldn't. His voice hadn't changed, but something behind his eyes had, the same way it had the night he first saw the pendant at her throat. She didn't push him that night. She'd learned, over 30 years, when pushing worked and when it only drove him further behind whatever wall he'd built. Instead, long after he'd gone to walk the grounds alone the way he always did when something weighed on him, Serafina searched his private chambers, not out of suspicion, but out of a need to finally understand the shape of whatever he was protecting her from. She found it behind a false panel in the wall nearest his desk, a small locked chest, old enough that the wood had darkened with age, hidden with more care than anything else in a castle full of gold. Inside, beneath a layer of documents bearing seals she didn't recognize, lay a single folded letter. The handwriting was her mother's. Her hands shook as she unfolded it. The ink had faded in places, the paper soft with age, but the handwriting was unmistakably her mother's. The same careful, slanted script Serafina had spent years trying to remember and never quite could. She sat down on the edge of Valor's desk, chest tight, and read. Her mother had not been an ordinary woman. She had belonged to the Wren bloodline, a family so old that even the vampire histories in Valor's library only mentioned them in passing, as a footnote to something far larger. The Wrens, the letter explained, were guardians of a secret buried at the very foundation of the vampire race itself. The first vampire king had not been cursed by some accident of fate or divine punishment, as the old stories claimed. He had bargained for it, immortality, purchased with something the letter didn't name, and sealed with blood that had never fully belonged to him. The Wren line carried the only blood in existence capable of undoing that bargain, of ending, if it chose to, everything that bargain had built. Serafina read the words twice before they fully settled. The letter went on. Her mother had been hunted while pregnant with her. By whom, the letter didn't say, only that the danger had been real enough to drive a woman from her home with nothing but the clothes on her back. She'd run for months, alone, carrying a daughter she knew would be hunted the same way the moment anyone learned what blood ran in her veins. Eventually, dying and out of options, she had found Valor. Serafina lowered the letter slowly. The final lines were the ones that broke something loose in her chest. Her mother had begged him, a king she'd had no right to ask anything of, to find her daughter if she didn't survive, and to protect her from a truth that would only ever make her a target. Valor had promised. And then, according to the letter, he had done something Serafina hadn't expected. He had chosen never to tell her daughter any of it, not out of secrecy for its own sake, but because a girl who didn't know what she carried couldn't be hunted for it. She heard the door open behind her before she heard him speak. "You found it?" Valor said quietly. She turned the letter still in her hand, and for the first time in 30 years, she looked at him and didn't recognize the man standing there. Not because he'd changed, but because she finally understood how much of him she'd never been allowed to see. "You knew my mother," she said. "You knew what I was. This whole time." He didn't deny it. "I spent 19 years looking for you." The admission landed harder than she expected. He told her the rest without being asked, as though the weight of 30 years of silence had finally become too much to carry alone. He'd followed every rumor of an orphaned girl that crossed his path in 19 years. Dead ends in border towns, false leads in cities half a continent away, records of Wren descendants that led nowhere over and over, until he'd nearly convinced himself the line had simply died out unfound. He'd searched every human settlement within reach of his kingdom at least once. He'd combed through genealogies so old the ink had turned to powder, and then 19 years after he made a dying woman a promise, he had walked into a poker room in a town that didn't matter, in territory he had no reason to visit, and found her standing behind a gambler's chair with her mother's pendant at her throat. "It was never a coincidence," Serafina said slowly, the truth arranging itself in front of her piece by piece. "You didn't just happen to see something in me. You recognized the pendant. You knew exactly who I was the second you walked through those doors. Yes, you knew Garrick was holding your dying friend's daughter as collateral in a card game. Yes, your fortune was never the real stake that night." Her voice had gone very quiet and very dangerous. "I was." He didn't try to soften it. "Yes." For a long moment, Neither of them said anything. 30 years of trust, built one careful season at a time, sat balanced against a truth he'd kept from her since the night they met. And Serafina felt for the first time in decades the old cold flare of having been managed rather than chosen. "Why didn't you tell me?" she demanded. "Not that night. Not in 30 years. Why?" "Because I was afraid," Valor said. "Of what? Of me?" "Of losing you." He said it plainly, without the composure he wore for everyone else in his kingdom. "I had already failed your mother once, Serafina. I promised her I would keep you safe, and every day I let you believe you were simply a girl I'd chosen to protect. I told myself it was the same promise, that not telling you what you were was protecting you from it. I would not fail her again. I would not fail you." She wanted to be angry at that. She was angry at that. Furious, in fact, in a way that had nowhere immediate to go. 30 years of half-truths suddenly visible all at once. But underneath the anger was something else. Something that recognized exactly what kind of fear could make a 300-year-old king lie to the one person he'd never lied to before. She didn't get the chance to say any of it. The bells began ringing before she could open her mouth again. Not the slow, ceremonial toll of the anniversary celebration, but the sharp, frantic clang reserved for one thing only. The outer walls had been breached. Valor was already moving before the second bell finished ringing, pulling her toward the door with the same instinct that had once made him cut a rope from her wrist without asking permission. A guard met them halfway down the corridor, breathless, blood already on his sleeve. "Assassins," he said, "inside the eastern gate." Valor's expression went utterly still. The same stillness Serafina remembered from a poker room 30 years and a lifetime ago. "Who leads them?" The guard's answer came like a blade. "Garrick Vane." Garrick Vane stood in the shattered remains of the eastern gate, looking nothing like the desperate man who'd fled Red Creek 30 years before. The mustache was gone, the soft middle burned off by 3 decades of harder living. He wore dark, unmarked armor instead of a gambler's coat, and behind him stood a line of vampires, unlike any Serafina had seen in Valor's court. Old, silent, watching the burning gatehouse, with the patient interest of men who had waited a very long time for this exact night. "You look well, your majesty," Garrick called across the courtyard, and there was nothing left of the fear he'd once carried out of that poker room. 30 years suits you. You're a fool if you think you can take this castle, Valor said. "I don't need the castle." Garrick's eyes moved past him to Serafina. "I only ever needed her." The truth came out of him in pieces, delivered with the satisfaction of a man who'd been waiting 3 decades to say it aloud. He hadn't lost that hand by accident, he told them. He'd never simply stumbled into owning a debt-ridden orphan girl. He had spent years working for something called the Crimson Court, an ancient faction of vampires who considered themselves the true guardians of the old bargain, the ones who remembered exactly what the first king had traded away to become immortal, and who had spent centuries searching for a way to make that immortality absolute, permanent, unbreakable. They had known about the Wren bloodline before Serafina was born. They had known her mother was pregnant, and hunted her not to kill her, but to control what she carried. And when the mother slipped through their hands and vanished, the court had simply waited, patient as stone, until the daughter surfaced. "We knew Valor would take the bait the moment he saw that pendant," Garrick said. "We needed him to bring you into his castle. We needed you close to his throne, not for a night, not for a year, for decades. The Wren blood doesn't wake on its own, little queen. It needs proximity to the throne it was made to answer." 30 years was exactly long enough. Serafina felt the ground shift beneath everything she thought she understood. She hadn't simply been protected for 30 years, she'd been ripening. "The final stage begins tonight," Garrick said. And behind him, the Crimson Court began to move. By morning, word of what Garrick had shouted across the courtyard had spread through every level of the castle, and the kingdom's fear did exactly what fear always did. It looked for somewhere to land. Ancient vampires who had once merely disapproved of a human queen now stood before the council calling her something worse, a weapon planted inside their own throne room 30 years ago, patient as a blade waiting to be drawn. Some called for her execution outright. Baylor stood before the full council and let the silence stretch until every voice in the room had gone quiet on its own. "She did not choose this," he said. "She did not ask for this bloodline, this prophecy, or this danger. And anyone in this room who lays a hand on my queen will answer to me personally, whatever is left of your family name when I'm finished." Nobody tested him. But Serafina had spent 30 years learning that fear didn't listen to threats. It only listened to truth. So she did what none of Vaylor's advisors expected. She walked out onto the castle's highest balcony, in full view of the gathered court and the frightened city beyond its walls, and told them everything. That she carried the Wren blood, that she hadn't known it herself until weeks ago, that she understood now exactly why they were afraid. "I did not choose my blood," she told them, her voice carrying farther than she expected in the cold morning air. "But I can choose what I do with it." It didn't silence every doubter, but something shifted in the ordinary citizens gathered below. Servants, guards, the small folk who'd watched her build hospitals and open trade roads for 30 years. They believed her, and belief, she'd learned long ago, spread faster than fear when it had something true to hold on to. She didn't get long to feel the relief of it. The Crimson Court struck within the hour, breaching the lower wall in force, while Vaylor threw every guard he had into holding the breach. Serafina, ordered toward the cellars for the second time in her life, went instead in the opposite direction, deeper into the castle, toward a pull in her chest she couldn't explain, old and insistent, like something calling her home. It led her to the oldest wing of Nightshade Castle, corridors even the servants rarely walked, down a stair that seemed to have been carved before the castle above it existed. At the bottom stood a door she'd never seen, sealed in black stone, marked with a symbol she'd known her entire life without ever understanding it, crescent and thorn. She pressed her palm flat against the door, the same way her blood had once woken a stone in the library upstairs, and felt the ancient lock give way beneath her skin like it had been waiting 30 years for exactly this hand. Inside was a chamber untouched by time, shelves of records older than the Nightshade line itself, a full accounting of the first Vampire King's original bargain, and resting on a stone pedestal at the room's center, her mother's final journal, its cover worn soft from being read and reread by hands Serafina had never known. She read it standing, too urgent to sit. The truth, when it finally arrived, wasn't the one she'd feared. The Wren blood had never existed to destroy the vampire race. Whatever the Crimson Court believed, whatever the ancient elders had spent centuries fearing, it existed for one purpose only, to offer the king who carried the original curse a choice he'd never been given the chance to make. Immortality could end, but only if he chose, willingly, to give it up. She was still holding the journal when the chamber door burst open behind her. Vaylor stood in the doorway, blood soaking through his sleeve, breathing hard from a fight she hadn't seen. His eyes went past her to the ritual stone, glowing faintly at the center of the room, and then to her face, and understanding moved through him the same way it had moved through him, the same way it had moved through her a moment before. "It isn't asking me to kill you," Serafina said quietly. "No," Vaylor said. He looked at the stone a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had gone very still. "It's asking me to become mortal." The Crimson Court found them before either of them could decide what to do with the truth. They came down the old stair in numbers Vaylor hadn't expected. A dozen ancient vampires, faces Serafina didn't recognize, but bodies that moved with the terrible economy of creatures who had survived centuries by never wasting emotion. At their head walked a tall, gray-eyed elder Garrick had called only Master. On the ride down a man whose age Serafina couldn't begin to guess, and whose eyes, when they landed on her, held none of the fear the rest of the kingdom had shown. Only hunger. "The girl's blood," the elder said, as though continuing a conversation begun centuries ago. "Bring her forward, and this ends quickly." "You'll have to go through me," Vaylor said. "I intend to." He wanted her blood not to break the curse. Serafina understood in the space of a single breath, but to seize it, to take the power the ritual would release and bend it into something no king before him had ever held. Absolute immortality. Total control over every vampire bloodline that had ever descended from the first bargain. He didn't want the curse to end. He wanted to own it. The fight that followed filled the ancient chamber with a violence Seraphina had never witnessed up close. Valor moved through the Crimson Court's soldiers despite the wound already bleeding through his sleeve, 3 centuries of combat behind every strike. But even his strength had limits, and the numbers against him kept coming. She didn't retreat to the shadows, the way she once might have. She grabbed a fallen guard's blade from the floor and placed herself at Valor's back instead of behind it, meeting the first attacker who came for her with a desperation that made up for what she lacked in skill. He didn't tell her to get behind him. There wasn't time, and some part of him, the part that had once told her she wasn't his property, understood, even mid-battle, that she'd earned the right to stand where she was standing. They fought as one for the first time in 30 years, and for the first time, neither of them was protecting the other alone. It was the journal, still gripped in Seraphina's free hand, that gave them their only real advantage. Between blows, she caught enough of the surrounding text to understand what the elder didn't. The ritual wasn't a weapon that could simply be seized. It required 3 things, precisely, or it wouldn't work at all. Wren blood, the blood of the Nightshade King himself, and a willing surrender, freely given, not stolen, not forced. The Crimson Court had built 30 years of patient plotting around one enormous miscalculation. They believed Valor would refuse to give up what he was. No king in 300 years had ever chosen mortality when immortality was the alternative. They had planned for a fight over her blood, never imagining he might simply hand over his own. They were wrong. Understanding moved across Baelor's face in the middle of the battle, sudden and complete, and Seraphina watched it settle into something like relief. "If I give it freely," he said, low enough only she could hear, "there's nothing left for them to take. Valor, I know what it costs." He caught the next blow aimed at her on his own blade, driving the attacker back with a strength that already looked like it was beginning to cost him more than it once had. Strength, healing, the throne itself. If the elders decide a mortal man can't hold it, perhaps only a few decades left. "If I'm fortunate." "Then don't," she said, and for the first time since Red Creek, she heard her own voice break. "Don't do this. Not for me. Not only for you." He looked at her, and in his eyes was 3 centuries of a life he'd stopped valuing the moment she'd walked into it. "Seraphina, immortality stopped being a gift the day I met you. I have spent 347 years being afraid of nothing, because there was nothing left to lose. Do you understand what that cost me? I forgot what it meant to want more time. You gave that back to me. And I would rather have 30 mortal years beside you than 300 more alone in a castle no one was allowed to touch." He turned back toward the ritual stone at the chamber's center, and Seraphina understood, watching him cross the room, that she was watching the same man who had once emptied his entire fortune onto a poker table without counting it. Except this time, the stake wasn't gold. It was everything he was. "Deal me in," he'd said once, and meant a fortune. He said nothing this time. He simply placed his hand on the stone. The Crimson Court's leader realized what was happening, a half-second too late, lunging forward with a scream that had nothing left of composure in it, but the ritual had already begun, answering a will freely given, and no blade reached the stone in time to stop it, which left only one choice remaining: Seraphina's. The ritual needed her too. She understood that now, standing across the glowing stone from the only man who had ever asked her what she wanted, instead of telling her what she was. If she gave her blood freely, the curse would break. The Crimson Court's centuries of stolen power would collapse with it, and the immortal king who had built 30 years of safety around her would become, in the space of a single breath, an ordinary mortal man who could die of nothing more dramatic than old age. If she refused, the Crimson Court would eventually find another way. Another Wren, another 30-year plan, patient as stone, until they finally got what they wanted. She thought of Red Creek, of a rope cut from her wrist by a man who'd told her, before he'd told her anything else, that she belonged to herself. She pressed her palm against the stone beside his. "Together," she said. The chamber erupted. Light tore through the ancient crypt and up through every level of the castle above it, a pulse that ran through every vampire bloodline connected to the first king's bargain. Elders who had lived 4 centuries or more collapsed where they stood as power, older than the Nightshade throne itself, tore loose from them all at once. The Crimson Court's leader, still reaching for a stone he could no longer touch, opened his mouth to scream, and instead turned, in a matter of seconds, to dust that scattered across the chamber floor, and was gone. Valor fell. Seraphina caught him before he hit the stone floor, his weight suddenly, terrifyingly human in her arms, and pressed her hand flat against his chest, expecting nothing, the way she'd expected nothing from him for 30 years. She felt a heartbeat, fast, unsteady, entirely mortal. But there, thudding beneath her palm like something newly born, Valor's eyes opened slowly, and for one long moment, his expression held nothing but pure, unguarded terror. A man 347 years old, feeling his own pulse for the first time since before he could remember what that felt like. Then, impossibly, he smiled. "So this is what a heartbeat feels like," he said, his voice rough with something that might have been laughter or might have been tears. And Seraphina couldn't tell which, and didn't care. She pressed her forehead against his, both of them breathing hard on the crypt floor amid the dust of an empire that had just ended. The king, who had once feared nothing because there had been nothing left in 300 years for him to lose, finally had something precious enough to be afraid of losing. And for the first time since she'd known him, he didn't look like a man carrying centuries. He simply looked alive. The kingdom Valor woke to, in the weeks after the curse broke, was not the one he had ruled for 3 centuries. Vampires across Nightshade still carried what made them what they were: the strength, the long lives, the quiet, dangerous grace that had always set them apart from the humans they lived beside. But the ancient bargain that had once bound every one of their bloodlines to a debt none of them had personally made was gone, burned out of them in a single night in a crypt beneath the castle. They lived long. They no longer lived forever, chained to a curse they'd never chosen, and somewhere in the difference between those two things, the kingdom began, slowly, to breathe. Human settlements that had once kept a wary distance from Nightshade's borders started sending envoys instead of soldiers. Markets opened where checkpoints had once stood. Children who had grown up being told to fear the castle on the mountain began, within a decade, to grow up visiting it instead. Valor ruled through all of it, as a mortal man, slower now, gray threading through the silver at his temples, in a way that would once have been impossible, but no less resolute for any of it. Seraphina remained beside him, as she always had, queen. Still, though the word had come to mean something different than it had the night the court first whispered it with suspicion. They marked the anniversary that year, as they had every year since, but this time neither of them dreaded it. Instead, 30 years to the week after a rope had been cut from her wrist in a frontier poker room, Seraphina asked Valor to take her back to Red Creek. He didn't ask why. He simply arranged the journey. The town had grown old the way towns do, new buildings crowding out old ones. Streets paved where there had once been mud, half the faces on the main thoroughfare, too young to have any memory of what Red Creek used to be. But the Red Creek poker room still stood, weathered now. Its sign faded, the same scarred tables inside that had held a hand of cards 30 years before. The walls still carried old bullet marks. Nobody had ever bothered to patch. The room still smelled faintly of smoke and spilled whiskey, the way it always had, but it was no longer a place anyone feared. Word had traveled ahead of them, the way word always did, when a queen made a journey. And by the time Seraphina stepped through the doors, the room had gone quiet, in a way that felt entirely different from the silence she remembered. Nobody here flinched from her. They watched with something closer to reverence, the same expression Seraphina had seen over 30 years on the faces of villagers whose children had been treated in her hospitals, whose grain had been protected by her trade laws, whose lives had been quietly, steadily improved by a woman most of them had never expected to trust. The story of that first night had traveled with her, changing shape the way old stories do. For 30 years, most of the territory had believed some version of the same tale, that a vampire king had won an orphan girl at a poker table and taken her home as his prize. It had never been the truth. But it had taken 30 years for anyone outside that room to understand exactly how wrong it was. She found Garrick sitting near the back, the way she somehow knew she would. He was old now, properly old, in a way vampiric years never made anyone the Nightshade Court had grown used to. Whatever the Crimson Court had paid him in the years he'd spent working for them, none of it remained. His coat was worn through at the elbows. His hands, when he set them on the table in front of him, shook slightly, the way an old man's hands do. He recognized her the instant she walked through the door. There was no version of him in any lifetime that could have forgotten her face. He braced, visibly, for whatever she'd come to do. Serafina crossed the room and stood over the table where, 30 years earlier, he had named her as collateral in a hand of cards. She let the silence hold a moment before she spoke. "You thought I was something that could be won," she said. Garrick said nothing. There was nothing left in him to argue with. She glanced toward the doorway, where Valor stood waiting, gray-haired and mortal and entirely unafraid, the same man who had once emptied his fortune onto this very table without counting it. "You were wrong," she said, and left it at that. She didn't strike him. She didn't have him removed, or punished, or humiliated in front of the room the way 30 years of power would have let her. She simply turned and walked back toward Valor, and left Garrick Vane exactly where he'd been for 3 decades. Alone, forgotten, and finally, entirely powerless to matter. It was Serafina who told the room the rest of it, standing beside the old poker table with the whole history finally hers to give away. She told them about a dying woman who had found a king with nowhere else to turn, and asked him for a single promise. About 19 years he'd spent searching human settlements for a girl he'd never met, following rumors that led nowhere, refusing to give up a promise nobody would have blamed him for forgetting. About a pendant he'd recognized across a crowded poker room, and a fortune he'd risked not to win an orphan girl but to make certain no one could ever again treat her as something ownable. "He didn't win me that night," she said, to a room that had spent 30 years believing otherwise. "He won my freedom. There's a difference. It took me most of my life to understand it, and I'd like the rest of you to understand it faster than I did." Later, alone with him at the same table, she watched Baylor turn an old deck of cards over in his hands. Souvenir or ghost, she wasn't entirely sure which. "When I walked into this room," he admitted, quiet enough that it felt like it was meant only for her, "I believed I was here to keep a promise. Nothing more. I never expected the girl I was protecting to become the woman who'd rebuild my entire kingdom around her. I never expected to love you, Serafina. I only expected to keep my word. And I never expected the monster everyone in 3 kingdoms feared," she said, "to become the man I trusted more than anyone alive." He set the deck down on the scarred pine between them. The same table, the same wood, 30 years and an entire lifetime later. "Play one more hand," he asked, something almost boyish in it, a smile she'd only ever seen him wear for her. She laughed, an easy, unguarded sound that would have been unthinkable in this room 30 years before. "You've already gambled enough for 1 lifetime," she told him. Valor took her hand instead, the same careful, deliberate grip he'd used the night he cut a rope from her wrist. And this time, there was nothing left to prove with it. "Then no more wagers," he said. They left the poker room together, out into a red creek that no longer had any reason to fear either of their names. Behind them, the old table remained, scarred, weathered, ordinary, the place where a frightened orphan had once been treated like property, now remembered instead as the place where a kingdom's future queen was finally handed her freedom. 30 years earlier, the kingdom had whispered that the vampire king won an orphan girl at poker. 30 years later, they finally remembered her secret. She had never been the prize. She had been the reason he played. And, in the end, the king who had once risked his fortune for her had risked his immortality too, and found, on the other side of both wagers, that he had never once lost anything that mattered.